Good morning, everyone. We are totally overwhelmed by the response we have received to today's event. I think last we checked, the registrations have crossed almost 2,500 throughout the day. So before we start the proceedings, a few housekeeping comments for all of you. Please note that registration shall be open all through till about 3 p.m. today. If by any chance you're unable to register, please do not worry. We are live on YouTube, and hence you can catch us there as well. The YouTube link shall be posted across all our social platforms as well as in the chat below. And we welcome your questions at any point during the deliberations, and please keep asking your using the Q&A tab in your Zoom window to share any of your questions. Again, heartfelt gratitude to all of you for showing us your support and encouragement. This virtual event, I'm told, is the first of its kind that has been attempted in recent times. And we sincerely hope you leave us today with a richer experience, and do forgive us for technical glitches. We are all still learning. This is a new way of work. So moving on, the most difficult battles are the battles that we fight with ourselves. One of the lessons that I have learned from the Indian freedom movement is that Gandhiji was not only fighting against the British, but he was also fighting against India itself. The years 1915 to 1948, the Gandhiji's years, not only gave India political freedom, but it also changed India forever, maybe the world forever. Jawaharlal Nehru, in the Tryst with Destiny, had said, the service of India means the service of the millions who suffer. It means the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. We are celebrating our 74th Independence Day tomorrow, and we have gone ahead in leaps and bounds in service of India. Indian GDP crossed the UK in 2018, we crossed France in 2019, and in the next few years, we'll cross Japan and Germany. So the only two countries ahead of us will be US and China. But in per capita GDP, there are 138 countries ahead of us. And this per capita GDP should make our young people angry and our young women angry that, look, we have to fix India. And the ground movement towards fixing this problem would actually lay down the framework for India for the next 25 years or maybe longer. So towards a free India, towards an employed India, the fight is with ourselves. Fight is to formalize India. Fight is to urbanize India. Fight is to industrialize India. Fight is to financialize India. And fight is to skill India. So from one of my millennial colleagues who loves to connect art with technology and business, I got to hear a shahir to Diwanvi Shairi yesterday. Hazar barf gire, lakh आंधियां उठे, वो फूल खिल के रहेंगे जो खिलने वाले हैं. And incidentally, I know someone who can make flowers bloom. I mean, most of you already know Manish. However, let me introduce him to you the way I know him. Manish is the one who can make flowers bloom even in a desert. An eternal optimist, one for whom life is a continuous journey of growth, learning, and challenging status quo, and one who is a true patriot. He inspires us to imbibe the vision of putting India to work as a daily mantra. Hence, no one more suited than him to show us the blueprint ahead for an employed India, a free India. Manish, over to you, please.
Thanks, Ritu. It's absolutely wonderful that you're doing this today. You know, growing up in India in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I always sort of felt that there was a distinction between freedom and independence. You know, we were independent, but freedom implies choices, the ability to make choices. And too many Indians I knew, I mean, we always say this at TeamLease, that the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and your PIN code wisely. And that is why we're not free as a country, or till most of our people are not free to make those choices. Where you were born doesn't matter, who your parents are doesn't matter. We will sort of have a gap between independence and freedom. And maybe that gap is in all our lives, right? I mean, what is a heaven for if your grasp doesn't exceed your reach? But I think we do have to ask us this important question. How have we created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society? But why didn't we create the world's largest economy? And that's an interesting divergence, right? I mean, technically, building a democracy would be harder than building an economy. An economy is an engineering problem, while a democracy is sort of a painting of a picture rather than the solving of a sum. And I would submit that in 1947, we made two huge risks. Some sociologists call them two reckless experiments, one political experiment and one economic experiment. And the political experiment paid off remarkably, and the economic experiment went wrong remarkably. That's okay. You know, postmortems have a certainty that prescriptions don't, and we are fixing our economic experiment since 1991. But it's important to recognize that the political experiment was a really big gamble. No country in the world had ever given universal franchise at birth. Some women in England got to vote in 1922. Some women in Switzerland got to vote in 1972. So no country had ever said that everybody will get the right to vote. In fact, most political scientists advise India that this would be a mistake. Let's do what the world has done, which is first give votes to the landed, then give votes to the rich, then give votes to the educated, and then give votes to women. And India made the 299 remarkable people who wrote our constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates. I would urge anybody who hasn't looked at them to do that. Probably had every debate that we are having today, but most importantly, they made the firm conviction call that everybody will get a right to vote from day one. And I think the difference between India and Pakistan born on the same night is that 3 million people win an election in India, 22 million people stand for an election. So that political experiment, which from our constitution, you know, we'd had a constitution by 1950, Pakistan didn't have a constitution until 1972, actually. So it's important to recognize that that political experiment will. But what happened to our economics? I mean, COVID reminds us that per capita GDP matters more than total GDP, right? We are fifth in total GDP, but we are 138 in per capita GDP. And the 1955 Avadi resolution was a bold experiment. The 1952 second five-year plan put that bold experiment into action, where we kneecapped the private sector, we kneecapped capital markets, we nationalized banks, we introduced the license Raj, and we decided that the public sector would have the commanding heights of the economy. But what was the consequence of that? It was that today India's labor is handicapped without capital, and our capital is handicapped without labor. We have 63 million enterprises, yet we only have 70,000 GST registrants with revenues of more than 5 crores. We have a labor force of 500 million people, but half of them, close to half, 45% in agriculture, only generate 14% of our GDP. Half of our labor force is technically self-employed. That isn't self-employment, it is self-exploitation. They are not pricing their labor, they're not pricing their family, they're not pricing the resources they put into business. And that's why I sometimes think that we have to be very careful when we sort of look at our numbers. But we are quite clear at TeamLease that unemployment or its first cousin or sibling underemployment is really a difficult question for India to solve. But this isn't a question like cancer or climate change. This is a plumbing problem. We have a matching problem. There are jobs where people aren't, and there are people where jobs aren't. We have a repair problem where people are educated, but they're unemployable. And we have a prepare problem. And I think that repair, prepare, and matching are very low-hanging fruit in the reform, in my mind. And I think that we are making some progress. But in the context of looking forward to say that what is the difference between independence and freedom? And how do we give all our citizens that right of freedom? So let's step back a little bit and look at the short term and the long term, because sometimes, you know, our consciousness gets crowded out by the weather of the moment. And COVID is a passing shower. COVID isn't climate change. I mean, it is a small virus. It is very infectious, but humankind will triumph over it, and we will return to normal life. Now, is there a new normal? That seems too sort of cliched. You know, COVID doesn't really create new trends. It accelerates existing ones. There is a new world of work. There is a new world of education, and there is a new world of organizations that has been in the making for decades, right? Employment has changed from a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship since Organization Man, which was a book by William White, was written in 1956. In a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless. Learning how to learn is the key skill. You know, the 30 years of learning, 30 years of earning, and 30 years of retirement as a plan for your human life, that train had left the station almost 2 decades ago because knowledge was changing so fast. And the new world of organizations where the average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company is just 15. So what's the value of a pension promise from a large organization? Don't get me wrong, I've never met a small organization that doesn't want to be a large organization, but we also are realizing that maybe the law of nature sort of atrophy applies to large organizations. And the key skill in the future will be how to retain the agility of being small, but retain the resources of being large. So in the short run, I think there are three questions which make the short run unmodelable around the virus, around consumption, and around professions. The question around the virus is obvious. Are we at the start, middle, or the end of the virus? Until we know that, everything's unmodelable, and nobody knows that. The question around demand. Will consumers and companies be frugal or hedonistic? Will they save for a rainy day, or will they live for today? I mean, the difference between needs, want, and desire has become really obvious in the lockdown to all of us, right? We need to eat, but we don't need to eat out. And that may be good for the environment, but it's really bad for the economy because 50% of global GDP is consumption. And that brings me to my third point of professions. There are too many professions in India which can't be done with social distancing. You know, China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India's farm to non-farm transition is happening to sales, customer service, and logistics. And many of these professions, and if you throw in hospitality, if you throw in construction, these professions can't be done with social distancing. And so sometimes I think that we have to really just be humble enough to say that we don't know when, only when the vaccine becomes clear, will demand become clear, will then the trajectory of professions become clear. But I would submit that this weather of the moment is absolutely the wrong way to make our plans and think about our visions, because all these are pre-existing conditions of the Indian labor market and the Indian economy. I mean, I'm surprised by the outrage at MSMEs or the outrage at labor migrants. I mean, what did you expect? I mean, MSMEs, shareholders don't pay salaries, customers do. Migrants who come to big cities are not running towards big cities, they are running away from villages. And so it's important to sort of be careful about these positioning these things as conflicts rather than trade-offs, right? All we can do in the short run is to ensure the broadest shoulders bear the heaviest burdens, which means that disease does not convert to death, which means that unemployment does not convert to hunger, and working capital problems don't convert to bankruptcy. That's really what fiscal policy, monetary policy, and everybody should try and do right now. But do we only quit smoking and lose weight when we have a heart attack? You know, can India change for a better option rather than change when you have no option? I'm not sure that should be our reality. And that, you know, approaching 75 years of independence, why don't we step back and say, well, India is going to raise our ambition. You know, we are not going to only target total GDP, which we're number 5 anyway, and we'll probably be number 3 in a few years. Only Japan and Germany are ahead of us now. We crossed UK recently. But we want to be in the top 50 in per capita GDP. I mean, with a population like ours, we'll never be in the top 10 or top 20 because small countries will have an advantage. But we cannot be 138 in per capita GDP. And the question is that there are 2 reasons why what I call, or what I have always admired as the most important theory in political economy, which is very ignored by John Kingdon, called a policy window. A policy window has opened because of COVID. A policy window has opened because of China's aggression on our borders. And I think that that policy window is a really important thing to take advantage of for India. A policy window is when the problem, the solution, and the timing come together. Actually, India's problems have been known for quite a long time. You can look at the Constituent Assembly debates. You can look at 1955 Avadi Resolution or the second five-year plan. Actually, solutions have been obvious. There's a report 20 years old in most areas, right? You could change the date on the Kothari Committee report of 1968 and not go wrong. You could change the report on Rustamji Committee of Police Reforms in 1979 and not go wrong. In fact, Apprenticeship Act was the 20th point in Indira Gandhi's 20-point program in 1975, and we still didn't get it done. And it's not that we didn't even have, some people say, oh, well, the message is different from the messenger. But let's look at vocational training. In 1938, Gandhiji articulated Nai Talim, which was a vocationalized view of education. Yet vocational education was obviously neglected by the British because they knew it would accelerate their demise. But even post-independence, the 1948 Radhakrishnan report ignored it, the 1968 Kothari Committee report ignored it, and the 1986 National Education Policy ignored it. It's only now in the national education policy that we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about vocationalization, we're talking about apprenticeships, and we're talking about all the other stuff that recognizes that college is really important, but so are skills. And you can't separate the world of theory and practice. You can't separate the world of academy and employers. So I think that there's a really, really important opportunity for us to do education reform, for us to do compliance reform, for us to do banking reform, for us to do urbanization reform, and obviously for us to just think about industrialization, which is not really manufacturing, but the farm to non-farm transition. I quickly spent a few seconds on each. The compliance reform is obvious to all of us. There are 68,000 compliances for employers. There are 6,000 filings, and they are changing about 8 times a day, which means 6,000 times a year. Now, obviously, this whole universe, no single employer is subject to it. But basically, your compliance complexity compounds with geography, compounds with size, and compounds with headcount. And that doesn't make sense and that is probably one of the reasons why 63 million enterprises only end up in 22,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. But what most people don't realize is 8,000 out of these 67,000 compliances prescribe jail. One of the most interesting lines in the Vishnu Sahasranam roughly translate to saying, why did God create fear? So he could take it away. Why are there 8,000 compliances? So that, it leads to corruption. It leads to lots of problems with employers not scaling because bureaucrats can be corrupt because they can throw you in jail for what really should be civil offenses, not criminal offenses. So compliance reform is, if we want to attract factory refugees, we need to change we need to reduce the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. Many of us in India have made peace with this, saying labor laws are a thorn in the flesh, they are not a dagger in the heart. But for somebody sitting in Seattle or somebody sitting in London or somebody sitting in Berlin, they will look at Indian law and how it is written, not how it is interpreted, practiced, and enforced. And how the Indian law is written is really, really difficult for employers. So compliance reform is really, really important. I think we've captured a lot of education reform, the new education policy. I think it represents a good vision for the next 10, 15 years. There will obviously be key of execution, so I don't need to cover that, but it has enough for school, college, and vocational training. I think financialization, which Ritu also talked about, is really important because our credit to GDP ratio is 50%. It needs to be 100%. I think China's 300% is wrong. But India had 97 banks in 1947. We only have 94 banks, scheduled commercial banks today. So we need to raise the number of banks. We need to raise competition. We need to raise governance so that I think the pain of MSMEs and migrants would have been much lower if our credit to GDP ratio was 100% rather than 50%. That's quite obvious. I think urbanization reform is an interesting question, right? That many people are giving up on offices. But that's like giving up on cities. New York's GDP is more than Russia, with 6% of the people and 0.0000005% of the land. For a reason, there are benefits to coming together, creativity and productivity. And India only has 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. But I think it's probably a mistake to position this as a conflict between state and center. Indira Gandhi in 15 of her speeches said strong states lead to a weak nation. N.T. Ramarao often used to say the central government is a conceptual myth. India is run by chief ministers. I think both of them were wrong. I think we need a strong center and we need strong states. So in sort of wrapping up here, if we think about industrialization as the final point, we talked about financialization, we talked about urbanization, we talked about formalization, which is compliance reform, and we talked about urbanization. Industrialization is really the farm to non-farm transition, which is really the biggest mistake in 1991. In 1991, we obviously left out corruption. We obviously left out formalization. I think we left out education. But the most important single goal should have been is the only way to help farmers is to have less of them. And that is really why India is not as free as it is independent, because 45% of our labor force works on farms and it only generates 14% of our GDP. And the notion that we should shove more people into farms, or I hear this silly notion that because of COVID, all the migrants have gone back to farms and suddenly rural demand will increase. Well, that's not going to happen. So I think the only way to help farmers is to have less of them. And the agricultural reforms done recently are very important around sort of essential service, around the Essential Commodities Act and many things else. So I think that in policy change, what we have learned at TeamLease is there is a difference between the list of ingredients and the recipe. There is clearly a difference between being idealistic and being practical. So life is second best at best, as Avinash Dikshit, who's one of my favorite professors at Princeton, reminds us about reforms. And obviously, we need to think about a collective action failure among employers. I have often fought with many of the industry associations where I say, as an individual company, yes, I want to tweak customs. I want to get this change for me. I want to reduce excise. I want to get rid of labor laws. But we need to be pro-market. We don't want to be pro-business. Much of business has lost its credibility because it's of its naked self-interest rather than national development. I think self-interest is a great motivator, but I think we need to move beyond saying that, give me an opportunity as this company to be successful, to saying, let's give our economy a chance to be successful. And that happens when you have a competitive economy, when you have a meritocratic banking system, when you have a rules-based compliance system. And I think that is really what was missing. But I think that, it's a unique time. We've probably got more talk about labor reform, more talk about banking reform, more talk about ease of doing business reform, more agricultural reform, more education reform in the last sort of 6 months than we have got in a long time before that. And that really represents the COVID policy window. It represents the recognition that India's status quo doesn't need more cooks in the kitchen, it needs a different recipe. Throwing more money at government schools is not going to help. You're going to have to do government performance management and sort of governance reform. So I think, fighting the battle for ideas is really, really important. The battle for ideas, which was fought in politics for universal franchise, for state versus center. I mean, some of the most interesting debates in the Constituent Assembly were between should we have fundamental rights and directive principles, and I think that battle for ideas was fought by people, but politically. But in the economy, I think we didn't fight the battle for ideas as vigorously after independence as we should have. And now is the time to do that. In 1942, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote from Ahmednagar jail that, whether we were successful or not, historians of the future will judge. But we aimed high and looked far. I think they aimed high and looked really far politically. But I think economically, in retrospect, and maybe it's hard because the whole world was thinking that way when they were around. I think it's really important to think about the new tryst with destiny. Our political tryst with destiny got met. Our economic tryst with destiny has a gap, but that's okay. I mean, Samuel Huntington once used to say that the gap between India's reality and its aspiration is not a lie, it's a disappointment. And it is only a disappointment because our aspirations were really high. We could have chosen not to give universal franchise. We could have chosen to lower our expectations. That's one way to meet your goals. But I think that's probably the wrong way to meet your goals. And so I'm quite clear that if you want to get reform, it is not about our abilities, right? There's a wonderful new biography of Dadabhai Naoroji by Dinyar Patel, where, and most people don't remember Dadabhai Naoroji, but he's one of the makers of modern India. He's one of the first people who spoke about Swaraj in 1906. And the wonderful description of Dadabhai Naoroji is he was too moderate for the radicals and he was too radical for the moderates. And I would submit anybody who wants to get labor reform in India needs to stop saying, let's have zero labor laws. So you can't, if you're going to ask for zero labor laws, you're going to get zero reform. But if you want to get labor laws, you need to be a little more than saying, well, let's just add up all of them and do a word processing exercise and put them into 4 labor codes. That's not radical enough for us to spark off the job creation. So I think that it's not only as you get older. In fact, one of the most interesting comments about Dadabhai Naoroji in that biography was he got more radical as he got older. Most of us get more conservative as we get older. But Dadabhai Naoroji kept learning. He was open to new ideas. He would always expose himself to evidence. One of his biggest was drain theory. And I would submit that Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory, which was the economic argument against the empire, was really, really important in fighting the battle for ideas. And that battle for ideas now needs to be refought almost 100 years after Dadabhai Naoroji made his drain theory, that your economic system is not working. And I'd like to make the case that our current economic system works for many people like us and Ritu and many of you attending this because we chose our parents wisely and we chose our PIN code wisely. But it doesn't work for millions of people. There are 300 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver or sit in the car that they clean or send their kids to the school that they build. This is not a problem like cancer or climate change. This is a plumbing problem. Our new Trust with Destiny is about the infrastructure of opportunity. The infrastructure of opportunity is about the equality of opportunity. And the equality of opportunity is about 3 E's of education, employment, and employability. So I'm quite confident that India has made a new appointment with her Trust with Destiny. This is one we will keep. And this is one which involves us thinking about productivity of our cities, productivity of our enterprises, and productivity of our individuals. Because as Dadabhai Naoroji said almost 100 years ago, poverty is about productivity. And the system needs to allow people and firms and geographies to be much more productive than we are. But I'm quite clear that we're in an absolutely unique time in India right now, and we look forward to the new Tryst with Destiny at TeamLease. It's wonderful that all of you are joining us today because obviously an unemployed Indian is an independent Indian, but he is or she is not a free Indian. Thank you. Look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manish. I think I do have a few questions for you, but before that, I would encourage all the attendees today that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask and raise in the Q&A tab. We already have a few interesting ones, but as you send us more questions, Manish, the first question I have for you is that why do you think change does not happen in spite of us knowing what to change? I mean, hasn't that been an issue? Why do you think that happens?
My own understanding is that most committee reports in the past have focused on what is to be done rather than how it is to be done. I think that idealists or people who don't engage with policy, and that's a large part of India's private sector who loves to crib about government but doesn't engage with government, there's no such thing as government. Government is a bunch of people. The bunch of people listen to people who engage with them. And I think employers who don't like India's labor laws or are hurt by India's laws don't engage as much with government as trade unionists or the labor aristocracy who believes that job preservation is a form of job creation. So I think that the engagement by employers who are scared of going on a front foot with regulators, going on a front foot with the government to say that, look, if you want us to create jobs, we need this. They always think that any criticism will lead to retribution. So first of all, we have a collective action problem among employers. So in this specific circumstance of job creation, I think the collective action of employers does not fight the battle for ideas, and therefore the ideas get taken by people who do fight those battles, which are usually insiders and privileged sort of aristocracy. The second one is most reform suggestions are about what is to be done rather than how it is to be done. And as all of us are realizing that the difference between the recipe and the list of ingredients is, can we get it? Who is opposing it? Why are they opposing it? How can we split the difference? How can we get started with 20 and then use 20 as base camp for 40 rather than propose 100, 0? So I think the political science has a lot to teach us about interest groups. Nobody cuts the tree they're sitting on. There are a lot of small vocal minority who is benefiting from today's status quo. But the silent majority always is unorganized and is unvocal because the costs are imposed in the short run of reform, but the benefits come over the long run. So back to the collective action problem, where I think all of us who want reform need to shift from focusing on what is to be done and ranting about that to thinking about how it is to be done. So collective action problem, we need to all fight the battle of ideas. Second is we need to shift from what is to be done to how it is to be done. And the third most important thing is raising our ambition. I think we cannot accept that there is anything cultural about poverty. We can't accept the government is always like this, that every government bureaucrat is corrupt or impotent, or every private sector guy wants to take debt and chip cow it on the banks. So our ambition needs to be higher because of an idealism around the three constituents. The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and nonprofits have scale deficit. But all three of us are needed for India's infrastructure of opportunity to be much better than what it is today. And it can be. So collective action, fighting the battle for ideas, focusing on how rather than what, and raising our ambition and aspiration is absolutely key to getting change.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. My next question, Manish, would be that, why do we not live up to our ambition of our own constitution, which is fairly detailed and fairly clear?
I think the constitution as envisaged, some of the most interesting debates were, should the constitution be realistic or should it be aspirational? I think that's a question for every organization and for every individual, right? Should your goals be ahead of your capabilities, or should they be 2 steps ahead of your capabilities, or should they be 5 steps ahead of your capabilities? Or should your goals not be related to your capabilities and they should be related to where you want to go, right? This is a debate many of us have internally in all our organizations. Should you compare progress to where you were, or should you compare progress to where you want to be? And some of the most interesting voices in the Constituent Assembly debate, whether it was Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, whether it was Hamsa Mehta, whether it was Ambedkar, whether it was Patel, whether it was Rajendra Prasad, kept reminding the 299 people who wrote the Constitution that we are writing a dream. If you don't have a dream, you can't have a dream come true. It's an old saying. And I think the 299 people remarked. So the Constitution is a dream. It is an aspiration. The difference between that aspiration and our reality is not a lie, it's a disappointment. But it is something that will always be ahead of us. Even if we reach the Constitution, I would submit we should rewrite it because it should be a continuously receding horizon, right? I mean, the Constitution is a living document. It has been amended 100 times since it was written in India. Most other constitutions have not. So I think that we have not lived up to our constitution. I mean, if you think democratically, I think we have. Now, people will criticize we're an election-only democracy. We don't have other things. Yes, but we are a democracy. And so that's, I think, important. I think the only place where I would sort of question our progress since independence has probably been on sort of the infrastructure of opportunity. The IITs were built, but primary education was neglected. College education was focused on, but vocational training was sort of neglected. We focused on employers and enterprises and self-employment rather than formal employment, which pays the wage premium. So I'd say these are niggling problems, and we are in the process of reducing that gap. But I think the disappointment with the Constitution should be measured sometimes by comparisons by 2 things. One is the recognition that it was an aspiration and we still have a way to go. And the second thing is that you have to compare it to every other country which got freedom from a colonial power. And relative to all those countries, my God, India is far ahead.
Thanks so much, Manish. We have some questions which have come in, and I think few of them I were anticipating given the current situation. So one question is, with changing times, small organizations, and not just small organizations, honestly, many organizations want to hire freelancers, part-time workers. We've so much talk about gigs. So how do we manage the regulatory law compliances environment in these emerging trends?
So I think that the law is always behind society and economy, right? The society and economy changes much faster than laws and bureaucrats do. And maybe that's how it should be, right? Because if the law started changing in advance, then it would be directing where the economy went rather than responding to where the economy went. So I think that society, first of all, we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. And second of all, society changes much faster than the government changes. So I think that the notion that we only work for 9 to 5 and get a wage every month is a relatively new concept in human history. I mean, the notion that work and employment and offices are all the same thing is only a 50 to 100-year phenomena in human history. So I think that the notion that work can only be done in an office and work can only be done as through an employment contract was anyway a suspect sort of notion, right? It assumes that all of us want to live in an economy, not a society. It assumes all of us have one role. It assumes all of us have a spouse at home who's not working, and you know, it assumes so many things. It was meant to work for white men who had a woman at home. That is no longer true of the world. The labor market diversity of labor, and it shows how labor market outsiders, the labor force participation of women, the labor force participation of people in small towns, the labor force participation of people who are less formally educated but highly skilled. I think there's so many ways in which the past system of employment, office, and work being connected and tied at the hip were very exclusionary in how they thought about it. You know, many people, the women coming back from the child break would have been much higher in India if we had this work from home possibility, or at least a flexible possibility a long time ago, right? And so I'd say people from small towns wouldn't have to be coming to big towns if to remote learning, right? So I think the reality is that we will now um, uh, have the government respond to this higher flexibility, to employers having concentric circles of different kinds of employment, from employers having multiple different kinds of work, separating work from employment, separating office from place of delivery. So I think that the gig economy or the flexible economy or the temporary staffing or consultants or freelancers, this has not been created by COVID. I mean, this was on for a long time, and governments all over the world are struggling to respond to it. And most importantly, they're struggling because stupidly they attach social security to employers. Social security needs to be made employer independent and location independent. India's social security systems, like ration cards, like everything, is linked to which city you're in and what is your home address. India's social security system needs to become employer independent, work independent, office independent, and city independent and state independent. Once you do that, suddenly you will see that this regulatory cholesterol will not be as problematic as it is. The problem that everybody in government is trying to do, and they're an answer looking for a question, is they're trying to fit everything around employers, offices, and work, because social security is linked to that. So I think that one of the most important reforms is Provident Fund, ESI, ration card, everything else. And it can't be linked only to employers. And once you get over that hump, suddenly there's no difference between the different kinds of employment.
Thanks, Manish. Manish, another question which says, India always have struggled to get itself established as an innovation nation. No major company has put any investments on true inventions. innovation culture and a system to recognize and monetize innovation does not exist. What should India do to accelerate this?
I mean, it's kind of patronizing when you tell people to be religious on an empty stomach, right? We all realized that a long time ago, that when you're poor, you focus on survival. And as you get richer, either as an individual or as a company or as a country, suddenly the country starts looking cleaner. Everybody, Indians are so good looking now, right? At the airports, when we had airports, we don't have them anymore. But everybody's so much fitter and everybody's so much more glowing. It there are certain parts of an economy. I mean, is America rich? Does America have good roads because it's rich, or is America rich because it has good roads? Does America Is America an innovation hub because it's rich, or is it rich because it's an innovation hub? I think it's a bit of both. And that's one of life's dilemmas, is does luck matter more or skill matter more, right? We can never unpack those two. So I would submit that this chicken and egg problem between us becoming an innovation hub and being rich, or being rich and becoming innovation, I mean, the only way to solve the chicken and egg problem is to become vegetarian, right? Which is do something completely different. And I think that that's what we're trying to do. And that's what at least we're advocating all day today, that there's nothing culturally wrong with Indians. It is just we're inadequately formalized, urbanized, industrialized, financialized, and skilled. And if you change this, you will see Swachh Bharat, in terms of physical cleanliness, you will see much lower corruption, you will see much higher productivity, you will see much higher women's labor force participation, and you will see many global companies come out of India. I mean, it's not clear to me that the 3 million Indians in the US, why they produce GDP equal to 20% of our GDP, even though they're such a small percentage of India's population. So I don't think there's anything culturally wrong with India about, we don't have an antibiotic reaction to innovation. We just have had a hostile, forget about innovation, we have had an environment hostile to job creation. So now that we're getting to start to create a fertile habitat for job creation, you will automatically see innovation, and you will automatically see companies come out of India that will be globally competitive and global in size.
Thank you, Manish. I think because we are quite short on time, I'll take one last question, which has come in from our YouTube audience, and which is, don't you think government should let wages be decided by market rather than state government fixing it for businesses, as we are a democracy and not living in time where bonded labor was prevented?
I think that's a complicated question. I can argue both sides. As Dadabhai Naoroji advised us, let's be too radical for the moderates and too moderate for the radicals. I don't think we can say that there are not lots of people in the private sector who would not exploit labor given a chance. I'd say that not enough of our people know their rights, not enough of them are educated, and some of them just don't have the choices. So I don't think a national minimum wage is a good idea. But I think a moderately low set minimum wage is not exactly a very, very bad idea. I think that as a society, we should accept. Now, is that wage 2,000 a month? Is it 4,000 a month? Is it 6,000 a month? Is it 10,000 a month? Let's have a debate. It's obviously not the same in Bombay that it is in Bangalore, and it's not the same in Hassan that it is in Bangalore. It's obviously not the same in software that it is in bricklaying. But I think that many of us in business, if we want to win this battle for ideas, we will have to acknowledge that not everybody in business is the Tatas, Infosys, or HDFC. And there are companies that we admire, but we want to be pro-markets, not pro-business. And I think that a non-national, non-sector specific agnostic minimum wage is not a bad idea. But it should be set realistically, and it should be set at a level that balances employers, employees, and society.
Thank you very much. I think, thanks so much, Manish, for spending time with us. It has set the tone for today's discussion. Just to share with all of you that, we started this Putting India Back to Work campaign initiative somewhere around late March, April. I think the pandemic had rattled all of us, and its impact on jobs and livelihoods had been telling. I think it's quite obvious. We are all aware of it. But in this journey of trying to put together, because I don't think anybody had any idea about how to approach the situation, I think through constant deliberations, I think we brought in experts from different industries, different functions, and we collectively tried to figure out that what's the best way to approach, what's the best way to get people back to work, what's the best way to get people back to work safely. And I think there are many people that we would like to thank. I think we've had since March till now almost 30 webinars, and we had experts coming in from all directions, from different parts of the country. I think we were able, this new way of working helped us understand that how well we can leverage the digital tools. So we had people and experts joining in from Bombay, Delhi, Pune, Hyderabad, Chennai, I think different kinds and from different sectors. And we'd like to show our gratitudes towards them, because their contribution and their participation actually helped us frame this entire initiative, and which is kind of become a movement. And that's why here we are today with a special Independence Day event for you to kind of put together all our thoughts and also look at the way forward. Just to give you a brief, the next session, which is coming up shortly, I think is, just give me a moment. Yeah. So I think we have shortly event coming up, which talks about, the topic is impact of COVID-19 on the future of jobs, and especially the future of jobs when it comes to some of the specific sectors, like in technology, in manufacturing. So I think we have one of my colleagues, Shiva, who is going to moderate that session. So that's coming up next. We have two exceptional panelists, Mr. Sharad Gulla, who is EVP and Head Corporate Services in RBL Bank, and Mr. Ranjit TP, Director Recruitment APAC of Volvo Group. So thank you so much for your participation. I'll see you guys back again in a while. Meanwhile, I'm going to hand over the baton to Shiva. Shiva, over to you now. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thanks all of you for being through this session. You can probably hop on to the next one. Thank you very much. Thanks, Manish, again. Thanks all of you.